always good to see Blair, as I said earlier. Right. I'd like to introduce you now to Dr. John Ryan, Certification Europe, and Director of Services, an expert and advisor in the area of energy and carbon management. But with a science background, John has been involved in the area of business risk management, system design, implementation and maintenance and audit for the last 15 years, and I think that's what you want to talk about there.
Thanks very much. That's a hard act to follow. So this afternoon, I suppose, what I wanted to touch on, firstly to say thanks very much for the invitation today. As Conor has mentioned, one of the areas that I and our business is involved in is risk. And I suppose that can be a positive word or something that causes a little bit of concern. And over the course of this morning, and indeed in the last presentation, we've heard about how organisations are adopting challenges within the context of sustainability, and very much focusing on the traditional pillars of sustainability in one shape or form. And in a lot of the presentations we've done at these events, we focus very much on the environmental theme, the energy theme, and the wider sustainability theme. But today, I suppose, given the wider risk area, and also given the more recent publication of concerns in relation to the ongoing changing risk profile for business, I thought I might do something just a little bit different and focus something that might be a little bit more oblique than usual, but is an important part of business sustainability. So I suppose I'm wearing my business owner's hat on here as opposed to maybe the more technical one. So my brief presentation is talking about the changing risk profile for the sector, and the sector being the food and drink sector. And within that, I suppose I wanted to pose a question this afternoon. And as industry is expanding, and I suppose I'm using food as a general catch-all for the wider sector, it's an important part of the overall economy. It's expanding. We can hear there's leading companies developing more facilities worldwide. But in that context, and with the way the world is changing and technology is changing, is there a need for us to rethink maybe how some of the areas of risk that affect our businesses are managed? And within that, given the amount of technology present to us, and I'm sure probably everybody in this room has a smartphone, which they're probably accessing their emails on a regular basis, filtering out the junk, and perhaps sometimes losing that email connectivity as a result of a malicious email, for example. But at this changing environment, is there a new area of risk that the food and drink sector needs to think about? And in that context, if you like, where should we be starting from? So, just as a thought, governance in organisations is an important part of any business. It's impacted and it's affected by a number of different things. But the management of risk within an organisation is there to protect the stakeholders within that business and their interests. And that could be internal or external to the organisation. It's obviously affected by an organisation's style, its ethos, its risk management processes, and its own risk appetite. And in a lot of cases, it's managed by standards. And we've just heard in the last presentation how Diageo, for example, have developed a specific set of standards and ways of going about their business to minimise risks to the capital projects, to that fantastic presentation. However, looking at some of the newer areas from a sustainability point of view, are there risks within the food and drink sector that are now getting flagged at board level that may not have been there before? And I think anybody who's been involved at board level in businesses or large undertakings, if I can use the dreaded terms of the Energy Efficiency Directive, probably sees that front and centre, where directors of businesses are going to have to sign off on matters maybe slightly outside of their comfort zone somewhat. So, taking a look at the changing risk profile, what I wanted to do is look at the typical areas of risk management that are focused on within the food and drink sector. And I haven't made these up. These are simply an amalgam of the typical areas that organisations look at when they're looking at risk management in the business. Supply chain, equipment, and we've just heard a lot about infrastructure and capital. Look at material spoil, food safety or contamination. And the one maybe in the orange box is the joker in the pack at the moment, and what I wanted to focus a little bit about today is cyber attack. You might say, what's that got to do with the food and drink sector? But I'll come back to that in a moment. And in looking at those areas of risk and the profile of a risk management solution within a business, and indeed building business continuity plans, and a lot of the companies we interact with are building business continuity plans to ensure that their businesses enjoy a sustainable future. And they look across these areas of risk as part of what they're doing from an assessment point of view. So they look at their supply chain, they look at the impact from changes to the weather, the infrastructure supporting that supply chain, the availability of critical or core suppliers, and even the financial capability of certain of those suppliers might have an impact. Traditional enough. One looks at the equipment or the asset side of the business. One looks at things like, typical failure issues, loss of availability. One looks at material, raw materials, how it's going from point A to point B. Are we going to have challenges from a storage contamination point of view? And a lot of the areas of risk that have identified or progressed within the food sector have been around those areas through maybe contamination events, product returns, product recalls. Have there been any in relation to the more electronic-based or indeed cyber-based risks affecting the organisations? And in most, I think that this is something that's going to become a new entrant on what I would describe as the risk registers within organisations. And perhaps it's on some of the organisations' ratings that you're working with yourselves. And there are lots of tools available to us in business to manage risk. And some of those are well known when you look at things like quality control, you look at food safety, sustainability, and there's a number of the ISO series, just as an example on the slide behind me at the moment. And most of those are orientated around managing single types of risk. However, bringing them together into a wider business continuity approach can allow for that type of overlap, where you look at the impact of one upon the other. But none of those maybe specifically do deal with the area of cyber risk, or do they? So what is the potential? And I've taken this screenshot from an organisation and didn't use any great technique in doing it apart from going on the internet and looking at hackmageddon.com, produce daily stats on what's happening. A very US-centric view, I will agree. But this gives you an idea of what's happening in the cyberspace on a daily basis. So on a daily basis, and as we're sitting here, someone somewhere is trying to perpetrate a cyber attack on a business. And there's lots of different reasons. And in the press in more recent times, one is seeing the concerns around critical infrastructure. And in fact, as part of the national strategy here in Ireland, looking at the protection of critical infrastructure from cyber attack. Some of you may have been a subject to it or been caught in some of the attacks so far where particularly personal data has been taken from organisations. But this screenshot, which simply shows a profile in January, shows there's lots of activity, and that's its intent. There's lots of this happening. And is there a risk in the wider food and drink sector? And in fact, back in 2013, which is a little bit dated so far, the Global Security Report produced by an organisation called Trustwave, who were consultants in this space, they identified that almost a quarter of data breaches, which is a particular type of incident, occurred in the food and beverage industry. And that they, with the retail sector, continue to be a top target for cyber attacks. Why is that? The retail sector typically involves the hosting of a lot of information or personal data, which may or may involve payment data or indeed your credit card and or personal details. Similar to the retail sector, and there's been some practical examples, and we'll give maybe a couple of examples of that in a moment. And why is the sector perhaps a little bit open to this type of attack? Well, in Trustwave's view, the fact of standardization actually of computer systems, which is common across a lot of these sectors, so if you get a security deficiency in one, it tends to be easily duplicated across the entire network. So these types of industries, which are highly connected and perhaps sometimes connected by a supply chain, can actually be more vulnerable or more susceptible to a cyber attack than a standalone individual business. So trying to focus in on specific examples for the food sector. Is this a reality? Well, in the US again, and I suppose one has to look at a risk profile, and from our experience of dealing with organisations, certainly a lot of US-based organisations are a lot more sensitive when it comes to this type of area than maybe organisations in our parts of the world. But while we're talking about personal data on those previous examples, what about the networks and infrastructure available to the industrial manufacturing sector? And this is a quotation taken from a conference held earlier this year where the US Department of Agriculture was flagging this, particularly in relation to the industrial farm sector. And particularly concerning that we use technology so much and are dependent on technology, and that information can be manipulated, not available, and that can have an impact on business. And I suppose that's the message to try and get across it. These are areas of potential risk within a business that an organisation needs to give consideration to. Some simple examples, and I've just picked a couple that could simply fit on one slide. If you look particularly at Hackathon, there's a multiplicity of those. particularly in the retail sector, and interestingly, hotels. And as someone who stays in a hotel every week, you sort of get a little bit concerned when week after week there are breaches of personal data. And I suppose the coding of key cards and the retention of particularly visa information is something that that sector really needs to get a handle on. But here's 3 different examples, one of which in the middle should be a bit familiar to us all, which is a little bit more local than the other 2. And in a lot of these cases, the focus has been on credit and debit card information. So nothing new in that, you would say. However, I take you back to the previous slide where the actual Farmers Association in the US are concerned about the impact from an infrastructural point of view. And infrastructural information security is a growing area of concern for lots of organisations, particularly those who own and operate facilities and or utilities. And I'm not sure if it's formed part of the risk profile in the larger organisations may be represented today, but where you've got a critical dependency on a national utility, and that national utility may or may not be open to a cyber attack, could influence where you might cite the manufacturing unit, or indeed where you might actually decide to make an investment. I'm not sure Conor put some of the features on the capital investment strategy of Diageo, but it's something that certainly a lot of the organisations that we're interacting with would look at now as part of their risk assessment. So, I see a typo on that. It should say, do standards play a role within this space? And you'd probably say, well, being in the standards business, I would say this. But I suppose what we're seeing is that organisations are actively starting to use internal and or external standards. And I've just given a couple of examples there on information security, risk management and business continuity, that within the wider governance framework that we're seeing organisations start to consider. And while the environmental impact and the social impact and or the wider impact on business and the communities in which businesses operate is important, the capability of that business to remain viable is an important pillar of sustainability as well. Sometimes comes up under the economic side of it, but I think as part of wider investment strategies, we're going to see organisations now start to look at this and factor it into maybe their locations, looking into their capital programme, or indeed simply looking at their business continuity arrangements, saying, have we covered all of the risk areas? And while we have a lot of internal capability around quality, supply chain and engineering control, are we missing a trick when it comes to this area of risk? And is that something that we need to factor in? So for these organisations, or for this type of an approach to be managed effectively, then I think a business needs to take a look at the wider supply chain and its wider business environment, make sure that that aligns with their own corporate strategy, their governance and their capability, so that they factor in both those corporate and or operational needs. And in a lot of cases they may not be wholly aligned together. So, very brief, as I said at the start, so I'll come back to my question. As the food industry continues to expand, uses technology on a wider scale, moves into more far-reaching international client areas, expands its client base, and lots of the organisations represented here and in the food sector, particularly exporting out of Ireland, are now reaching far-flung destinations. Is there a need for them to rethink maybe some of the areas of risk that are featuring on their risk registers? My view as a professional in the risk management space is yes. Risk is something that affects us day in, day out. It doesn't mean that it's something that necessarily is going to cause a negative impact on our business, provided it's identified, provided it's mitigated, and provided it's controlled. But the danger is that the emerging risk areas of business may not factor into our conversations at this moment in time. So it's important that those emerging risk areas are factored into organisational strategy, and that the systems that are operated are informed and relevant to the business, using both internal and external standards where appropriate to make sure you remain best in class. Thank you very much.